There is no pain deeper than losing a child. For a father, it is a wound that never heals, a silence that echoes louder than any scream. Arthur Caldwell knew this pain well, and it had hollowed him out from the inside. His boy, Jeremiah, had vanished without a trace 3 weeks ago, leaving behind only questions and a grief so heavy it bent Arthur's shoulders like an old yoke. But his son's sheepdog, Buster, refused to let him give up. Every evening at sundown, the dog would stand outside the window and tap a strange rhythm on the glass. Arthur thought it was just the animal's grief, until one night he recognized the pattern. It was Jeremiah's drumbeat, the one he played on his tin soldiers. Could his son still be alive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The Wyoming wind carried dust across Arthur Caldwell's ranch like it had done for 30 years, indifferent to the grief that now saturated every corner of the property. The land stretched out in all directions, rolling prairie meeting distant mountains, a vista that once filled Arthur with pride and now only reminded him of how small and alone he truly was. The ranch house stood weathered and worn, its white paint peeling in long strips that curled away from the wood like old skin. The barn leaned slightly to the east, a tilt that had worsened over the years, and the fence posts that marked his property line sagged in places where he no longer had the heart to repair them. Arthur sat in his chair by the front window, the same chair he had occupied every evening since Jeremiah disappeared. The leather was cracked and worn smooth by decades of use. It had been his father's chair before him, and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of Caldwell men had watched the sun set from this very spot, but Arthur suspected he would be the last. Without Jeremiah, the line would end with him, and the thought sat in his chest like a stone. He was 56 years old, though he felt ancient. His hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of ranch work, rested on the arms of the chair with a tremor he could not control. His face was deeply lined, carved by sun and wind and sorrow. Grey stubble covered his jaw because he had stopped bothering to shave. His eyes, once a sharp blue, had gone pale and distant, as though he was looking at something far beyond what anyone else could see. The house was too quiet. It had been quiet since Sarah died 2 years ago, but her absence had been a different kind of silence. That silence had been sad, but complete, a chapter closed. This silence was jagged and raw, full of unanswered questions and impossible hope. Jeremiah's room remained exactly as he had left it. Arthur walked past the door a dozen times a day, but could not bring himself to enter. Through the gap in the doorway, he could see the corner of the bed with its patchwork quilt, the one Sarah had made when the boy was born. On the shelf above the bed sat a row of tin soldiers, hand-painted cavalry figures that Jeremiah had collected since he was 5 years old. The boy used to line them up and march them across imaginary battlefields, tapping out drum beats with his fingers on the wooden shelf. Tap, 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 a rhythm all his own. Arthur could still hear it in his mind, that peculiar cadence. Jeremiah had been particular about it, insistent that it was the real cavalry drum call, though Arthur suspected the boy had invented it himself. It did not matter. The sound had filled the house with life, and now its absence was deafening. The boy was 10 years old, small for his age, with his mother's dark hair and serious brown eyes. He had been a quiet child, thoughtful and careful, the kind of boy who noticed things others missed. He loved animals, particularly Buster, the black and white sheepdog that had been his constant companion since he was 6. The two were inseparable. Where Jeremiah went, Buster followed, and the dog had loved the boy with the fierce, uncomplicated devotion that only animals possess. Sarah had died of pneumonia during a bitter winter. The doctor from town had come too late, and by the time he arrived, there was nothing to be done. Arthur had held her hand as she slipped away, and Jeremiah had stood in the doorway, too young to fully understand, but old enough. to know that something irreplaceable was leaving them. After that, the boy had grown quieter still, retreating into himself in ways Arthur did not know how to address. He tried, in his clumsy way, to be both father and mother, but he knew he was failing. The ranch demanded too much of his time, and grief had stolen his patience. Then, 3 weeks ago, Jeremiah had vanished. It was a Tuesday. Arthur remembered because Tuesdays were when he rode into Redemption Flats to pick up supplies. He had left the boy at home with instructions to finish his chores and stay close to the house. Jeremiah had nodded, obedient as always, and Arthur had ridden off without a second thought. When he returned 4 hours later, the boy was gone. At first, Arthur assumed Jeremiah had wandered off, perhaps following Buster into the fields. He called and searched the immediate area, his concern growing with each passing minute. By nightfall, panic had set in. He rode to Tom Whitley's ranch, his nearest neighbor 3 miles to the west, and asked if Tom had seen the boy. He had not. Together, they searched through the night, lanterns swinging in the darkness, voices hoarse from shouting Jeremiah's name. By morning, half the town had joined the search. Sheriff Moss, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a drooping mustache and a reputation for thoroughness, organized the effort. They combed the prairie, checked the riverbanks, searched every barn and shed within 10 miles. They found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no sign of struggle. It was as though the boy had simply evaporated. The townfolk offered theories. Some thought Jeremiah had run away, though Arthur could not imagine why. Others whispered about wild animals, though there had been no attacks in the area for years. A few suggested darker possibilities, strangers passing through or foul play, but there was no evidence to support such claims. After a week, the search parties dwindled. After 2 weeks, they stopped altogether. People returned to their lives, offering Arthur their condolences and their prayers. But privately, they had given up hope. Arthur had not. He could not. Every morning he woke with the irrational certainty that today would be the day Jeremiah came home. Every evening he sat by the window and waited. And every evening Buster appeared. The dog had been despondent since Jeremiah disappeared. He refused to eat for the first few days, lying by the boy's bedroom door with his head on his paws, whining softly. Arthur had tried to coax him outside, but Buster would not budge. Then, on the 4th evening, the dog had stood up, walked to the front door, and scratched too, to be let out. Arthur opened the door, and Buster trotted to the window where Arthur sat. The dog stood on his hind legs, placed his front paws on the glass, and began tapping. Tap, 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 tap. Arthur had watched, bewildered. The dog repeated the motion, his claws clicking against the pane in a deliberate rhythm. Then he stopped, dropped to all fours, and stared at Arthur with an intensity that was almost human. After a moment, Buster walked away, circling the house before returning to scratch at the door again. Arthur let him in, and the dog went straight to Jeremiah's room, where he lay down and refused to move. The next evening, the same thing happened. And the next, and the next. Every evening at sundown, Buster tapped on the window. Arthur began to dread it, the sound a painful reminder of his failure to protect his son. He considered locking the dog inside, but he could not bring himself to do it. Buster was grieving too, in his own way, and Arthur would not deny him that. Tom Whitley stopped by every few days, bringing supplies and checking on Arthur. Tom was a good man, in his early 60s, with silver hair and a kind, weathered face. He had known Arthur since they were boys, and he understood grief. He had lost his own wife years ago and had never remarried. "You need to eat, Grim," Tom said one afternoon, using the nickname Arthur had earned in his youth for his serious demeanor. He set a basket of bread and preserves on the kitchen table. "You are wasting away." Arthur shook his head. "I am fine." "You are not fine. Look at yourself." Tom gestured at Arthur's gaunt frame. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" "I eat. Not enough." Tom pulled out a chair and sat down, uninvited. I know you are hurting. We all are. But Jeremiah would not want you to do this to yourself. Arthur's jaw tightened. You do not know what Jeremiah would want. Maybe not, Tom admitted, but I know what Sarah would want. She would want you to take care of yourself. She would want you to keep going. Why? The word came out sharper than Arthur intended. What is there to keep going for? Tom was silent for a long moment. Then he said, because you do not know that he is gone, not for certain, and as long as there is doubt, there is hope. Arthur wanted to argue, but he could not. Tom was right. He did not know. And that uncertainty was both his torment and his salvation. Sheriff Moss had been less optimistic. He had come by a week ago, his expression grave. Arthur, I need to talk to you about Jeremiah. Arthur had known what was coming. You are giving up. No, Moss said carefully, but I have to be realistic. We have searched everywhere. There is no trail, no evidence. If someone took him, they are long gone by now. If he wandered off and got hurt, we would have found him by now. I am sorry, but I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that he is not coming back. Arthur had not replied. He simply stared at the sheriff until the man shifted uncomfortably and made his excuses to leave. Moss meant well, but he did not understand. Arthur could not prepare himself. He could not let go, not yet. Buster's nightly ritual continued, unchanging and inexplicable. Arthur tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it meant nothing. The dog was confused, disoriented by Jeremiah's absence. Animals did strange things when they grieved. There was no deeper meaning. But tonight, as Arthur sat in his chair and watched the sun dip toward the horizon, something shifted. Buster appeared at the window right on schedule, standing on his hind legs and placing his paws on the glass. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm was clear and precise, and for the first time, Arthur truly listened. His breath caught. He leaned forward, his heart beginning to pound. Tap, 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 tap. He knew that rhythm. He had heard it 1,000 times, echoing through the house as Jeremiah played with his tin soldiers. It was Jeremiah's drumbeat. Arthur stood so quickly the chair rocked behind him. He pressed his hands against the window, staring at Buster. The dog stared back, his brown eyes urgent and pleading. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythm repeated, deliberate and unmistakable. Good God, Arthur whispered. His mind raced. How could the dog know that rhythm? Buster had been there when Jeremiah played, certainly, but dogs did not mimic sounds like that. They did not tap out patterns with such precision. Unless Jeremiah had taught him. Unless the boy was somewhere tapping out that same rhythm and Buster could hear it. Arthur's hands trembled. He stepped back from the window, his thoughts a chaotic swirl. It was impossible. It was insane. And yet, what other explanation was there? He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door and his rifle from the rack above the fireplace. His hands moved automatically, checking the chamber, slinging the strap over his shoulder. He did not know what he was walking into, but he would not go unprepared. When he opened the door, Buster was waiting. The dog looked up at him, tail wagging once, and then turned and trotted toward the road. Arthur followed, his heart pounding in his chest, hope and fear warring inside him. For the first time in 3 weeks, Arthur Caldwell felt something other than despair. He felt possibility, and he would follow it wherever it led. The evening air was cool and carried the scent of sage. Arthur's boots crunched on the gravel drive as he followed Buster down the long path that led from the ranch house to the main road. The dog moved with purpose, his pace steady and deliberate, pausing every few yards to look back and make sure Arthur was still following. Arthur's mind raced as he walked. He had been so consumed by grief these past weeks that he had not been thinking clearly. Now, with the clarity that comes from sudden hope, he began to piece together the things he had overlooked. Buster's behavior had not been random. The dog had been trying to tell him something from the very beginning, and Arthur had been too lost in his sorrow to understand. The road into town was 5 miles of packed dirt that wound through open prairie. Arthur had walked it a bee 2,000 times, but tonight it felt different. The shadows were longer, the silence heavier. Every rustle in the grass made him tense, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle slung across his back. He did not know what he would find at the end of this journey, but he was prepared for the worst. Buster did not lead him into the wilderness, as Arthur had half expected. Instead, the dog stayed on the road, heading straight toward Redemption Flats. The town was small, barely more than a main street with a handful of buildings clustered around it. There was the general store, the saloon, the blacksmith, the bank, and the church. The church was new, built just 6 months ago to replace the old wooden chapel that had burned down the previous winter. Arthur's breath came faster as they approached the outskirts of town. The sun had set completely now, and the street was lit only by the glow of oil lamps in the windows of the saloon and the general store. A few people moved along the boardwalk, their faces indistinct in the dim light. Arthur kept his head down, not wanting to be seen. If this turned out to be nothing, if he was chasing shadows, he did not want the whole town to know about it. Buster led him past the main street, skirting the edge of town and heading toward the back of the buildings. The dog moved more cautiously now, his body low to the ground, his ears flattened. Arthur's pulse quickened. Whatever Buster was leading him to, the dog sensed danger. They came around the side of the general store and into the alley that ran behind the buildings. The church stood at the far end, its white clapboard walls gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It was a modest structure, with a tall steeple and a small bell tower. The Reverend Elias Croft had raised the money to build it, going door to door and collecting donations from every family in the county. He was a charismatic man in his late 30s, with dark hair and a voice that could fill a room. People loved him. Arthur had never paid him much attention, but Sarah had liked him, and Jeremiah had attended Sunday school without complaint. Buster stopped at the back door of the church and began to scratch at the ground. His claws dug into the dirt, and a low whine escaped his throat. Arthur crouched beside the dog, his hand resting on Buster's back. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. The dog's whine grew louder, more insistent. He scratched harder, his nails scraping against something solid beneath the dirt. Arthur pulled a match from his pocket and struck it, holding it close to the ground. In the flickering light, he could see the outline of a wooden trapdoor, partially buried. Beneath a layer of soil and debris, Arthur's heart pounded. He set the rifle down and began to dig with his hands, pulling away the dirt and exposing the edges of the door. It was old, the wood warped and splintered, but it was solid. A rusted iron ring served as a handle. Arthur grabbed it and pulled. The door did not budge. He braced his feet and pulled harder, the muscles in his back straining. With a groan of protest, the door lifted, revealing a set of narrow wooden stairs descending into darkness. The smell that rose from the opening was damp and musty, the scent of earth and mold. Arthur lit another match and peered down into the blackness. The stairs led to a basement, but he could see nothing beyond the first few steps. "Jeremiah," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer. Buster barked once, sharp and urgent, and then bolted down the stairs. Arthur grabbed the rifle and followed, his boots echoing on the wooden steps. The basement was larger than he expected, running the full length of the church above. The ceiling was low, supported by thick beams, and the walls were bare earth shored up with timber. Arthur struck another match and held it high. The light flickered over barrels and crates stacked against the walls, and in the far corner a heavy wooden door with an iron lock. Buster was already at the door, scratching and barking. Arthur moved toward it, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He tried the handle, but the door was locked. He stepped back and kicked it. Once, twice, 3 times. The wood splintered around the lock, and on the 4th kick, the door flew open. Inside was a small pantry, lined with shelves that held jars of preserves and sacks of flour, and huddled in the corner, his knees drawn to his chest and his face pale and tear-streaked, was Jeremiah. Arthur's knees nearly buckled. He stumbled forward, dropping the rifle and falling to his knees in front of the boy. "Jeremiah," he breathed, his voice breaking. The boy looked up, his eyes wide and filled with fear and relief in equal measure. "Papa," he whispered. Arthur pulled him into his arms, holding him so tightly he was afraid he might hurt him. Jeremiah clung to him, his small body shaking with sobs. Arthur felt tears streaming down his own face, hot and unchecked. He had found him. Against all odds, against all reason, he had found him. "Are you hurt?" Arthur asked, pulling back just enough to look at the boy's face. "Did he hurt you?" Jeremiah shook his head. "No, he gave me food and water, but he would not let me go. He said I could not tell anyone what I saw." "What did you see?" Arthur asked, though he thought he already knew. Jeremiah pointed toward the main room of the basement. "The gold. I saw him bury it." Arthur turned and looked more closely at the crates and barrels stacked against the walls. He moved to the nearest one and pried the lid off with his hands. Inside, gleaming faintly in the dim light, were bars of gold bullion stamped with the seal of the Territorial Bank. Arthur's blood ran cold. The stagecoach robberies. There had been 3 in the past 6 months, each one more brazen than the last. The thieves had stolen thousands of dollars in gold, and the marshal had been searching for them without success. No one had suspected the Reverend. No one had even considered it. "He found me here," Jeremiah said quietly. "I came into town to buy nails for the fence. I saw the door open and I was curious. I went down to look, and he was here, moving the boxes. He saw me and grabbed me. He said I could not leave, that I would ruin everything." Arthur's jaw tightened. Rage, hot and fierce, surged through him. He wanted to find Elias Croft and tear him apart with his bare hands. But first, he needed to get Jeremiah out of here. "Can you walk?" he asked. Jeremiah nodded. "I think so. My legs are weak, but I can walk." Arthur helped the boy to his feet and guided him toward the stairs. Buster ran ahead, his tail wagging now that his mission was complete. They climbed out of the basement and into the cool night air. Arthur pulled Jeremiah close, shielding him with his body as they moved quickly away from the church. They had made it halfway down the alley when a voice called out behind them, "Going somewhere, Arthur?" Arthur turned, his hand moving to the rifle he had left behind in the basement. Standing in the doorway of the church was Reverend Elias Croft, his face shadowed, but his posture relaxed, almost casual. He held a revolver in his right hand, the barrel pointed directly at Arthur. "I was wondering when you would figure it out," Croft said, his voice calm. "I have been watching that dog of yours for days. I knew he would lead you here eventually." Arthur pushed Jeremiah behind him, his mind racing. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself or the boy. He had walked straight into a trap. "Let him go," Arthur said, keeping his voice steady. "This is between you and me." Croft laughed, a low, bitter sound. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to keep your boy locked in a basement? I had no choice. He saw too much, and I could not risk him talking." "He is a child," Arthur said, his anger rising. "You could have let him go. You could have left town, but you kept him locked up like an fave animal." "I kept him alive," Croft shot back. "Do you think my partners would have shown him the same mercy? They would have killed him the moment they found out. I saved his life." Arthur took a step forward. "You are a coward and a thief, and when the marshal hears about this, you will hang." Croft's expression hardened. "The marshal will not hear about it, because neither of you are leaving here alive." He raised the revolver, his finger tightening on the trigger. Arthur tensed, preparing to throw himself at the man, knowing it was futile, but unable to do nothing. And then Buster moved. The dog launched himself at Croft with a snarl, his teeth bared. Croft tried to swing the gun toward the animal, but Buster was too fast. The dog's jaws clamped down on Croft's wrist, and the revolver discharged, the shot going wide and splintering the wall of the building behind them. Croft screamed and tried to shake the dog off, but Buster held on, growling and thrashing. Arthur did not hesitate. He ran forward, grabbing Croft by the shoulder and driving his fist into the man's face. Croft staggered back, and the revolver fell from his hand. Arthur hit him again, and again. Years of grief and rage pouring out of him in a torrent. Croft collapsed to the ground, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. Buster released his grip and stepped back, his sides heaving. Arthur stood over Croft, his chest rising and falling, his knuckles split and bleeding. He wanted to keep hitting him, wanted to make him pay for every moment of suffering he had caused. But Jeremiah's voice stopped him. "Papa, please, I want to go home." Arthur looked at the boy, standing small and fragile in the moonlight, and the rage drained out of him. He nodded and picked up the revolver, tucking it into his belt. Then he turned and walked to Jeremiah, taking the boy's hand in his. "Let us go," he said quietly. They left Croft lying in the dirt and walked toward the main street. Arthur's legs felt unsteady, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. But Jeremiah was safe. That was all that mattered. As they reached the street, Sheriff Moss emerged from the saloon, his eyes widening when he saw them. "Arthur? Jeremiah? What in God's name?" "The Reverend," Arthur said, his voice hoarse. "He has been keeping Jeremiah in the church basement, and he has the stolen gold down there, all of it." Moss stared at him for a moment, then turned and shouted for his deputies. Within minutes, the street was filled with people, all of them talking at once, their voices a chaotic blur. Arthur ignored them all. He held Jeremiah close and let the boy cry into his shoulder. And for the first time in 3 weeks, he allowed himself to believe that everything might be all right. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than the walk into town. Tom Whitley had appeared with his wagon not long after the commotion started, and he insisted on taking Arthur and Jeremiah home. Arthur sat in the back with the boy cradled against his chest, while Buster lay at their feet, his head resting on his paws. The dog's eyes were half closed, exhausted but content. Tom did not ask many questions. He simply drove, his hands steady on the reins, his presence a quiet comfort. Arthur was grateful for that. He did not have the words yet to explain everything that had happened, and he was not sure he ever would. Jeremiah had fallen asleep before they were even out of town, his small body going limp with the sudden release of tension. Arthur held him carefully, one hand cradling the boy's head, the other wrapped around his shoulders. He could feel Jeremiah's heartbeat, steady and strong, and the rhythm of it was the most beautiful thing he had ever known. When they reached the ranch, Tom helped Arthur carry the boy inside and lay him on his bed. Arthur pulled the patchwork quilt up to Jeremiah's chin and stood there for a long moment, just watching him breathe. The boy's face was peaceful now, the fear and exhaustion smoothed away by sleep. "I will let you be," Tom said quietly from the doorway. "But if you need anything, you send word." Arthur nodded, unable to speak. Tom clapped him gently on the shoulder and left, the sound of the wagon fading into the distance. Arthur sank into the chair beside Jeremiah's bed and let his head fall into his hands. The tears came then, sudden and overwhelming. They were not tears of grief this time, but of relief so profound it felt like drowning. He had come so close to losing everything. For 3 weeks he had lived in a kind of hell, not knowing if his son was alive or dead, tormented by questions that had no answers. And now Jeremiah was here, safe and whole, breathing softly under the quilt his mother had made. Arthur cried until there was nothing left, and then he sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him. The creak of the floorboards, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant call of a night bird. All of it felt new, as though he were hearing it for the first time. Buster pushed the door open with his nose and padded into the room. The dog curled up on the floor beside the bed, his chin resting on Arthur's boot. Arthur reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Good boy," he whispered. Good boy." Eventually, exhaustion claimed him, and he slept in the chair, his hand resting on Jeremiah's shoulder. When he woke, the sun was streaming through the window, and Jeremiah was sitting up in bed, watching him. The boy's eyes were red-rimmed but clear, and there was a tentative smile on his face. "Morning, Papa," he said softly. Arthur sat up, his back protesting the awkward angle he had slept in. "Morning, son. How are you feeling?" Jeremiah considered the question. "Hungry," he said finally. Arthur laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "Then let us get you some breakfast." They went to the kitchen together, and Arthur made eggs and bacon, cooking more than he had in weeks. Jeremiah ate slowly at first, as though his stomach had forgotten what to do with food, but then with increasing enthusiasm. Arthur watched him, marveling at the simple miracle of it. His son eating breakfast at the kitchen table. It was such an ordinary thing, and yet it felt extraordinary. "Can I ask you something?" Jeremiah said between bites. "Anything. Why did the Reverend do it? Why did he steal the gold?" Arthur set down his fork. It was a fair question, and one he had been asking himself. "I do not know for certain," he said carefully. "But I think sometimes people convince themselves that they deserve things they have not earned. The Reverend built that church, and maybe he thought the town owed him more than they were giving. Or maybe he just wanted to be rich. People do terrible things for money." Jeremiah frowned. "But he was a man of God. He taught us about right and wrong." "He was a man," Arthur said, "and men are flawed, some more than others. What he taught might have been true, even if he did not live by it himself." The boy thought about this for a moment. "I was scared," he said quietly. "I thought I would never see you again." Arthur reached across the table and took Jeremiah's hand. "I was scared too, but you are here now. That is all that matters." "How did you know where to find me?" "Buster," Arthur said simply. "He never gave up. He kept trying to tell me, and I finally understood." Jeremiah looked down at the dog, who was sitting hopefully beside the table, waiting for scraps. "He is a good dog," the boy said. "The best," Arthur agreed. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, and then Arthur suggested that Jeremiah rest some more. The boy did not argue. He went back to his room and climbed into bed, and within minutes he was asleep again. Arthur stood in the doorway, watching him, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise up in his chest. He would not let anything happen to this boy ever again. The days that followed were strange and unsteady. Word of what had happened spread through the county like wildfire. People came by the ranch in a steady stream, offering their congratulations and their sympathy, asking questions and sharing theories. Arthur tolerated it because he knew they meant well, but he found their attention exhausting. Sheriff Moss came by on the third day with news. Reverend Croft had confessed to everything. He had been working with two partners, men who had planned and executed the stagecoach robberies, while Croft provided them with information and a place to hide the gold. The partners had fled when they heard about Croft's arrest, but the territorial marshal was confident they would be caught. "Croft is going to prison for a long time," Moss said. "Maybe the rest of his life. And the town is getting their gold back. You did a good thing, Arthur." Arthur did not feel like he had done a good thing. He felt like he had stumbled through the darkness and gotten lucky, but he nodded and thanked the sheriff for coming. Jeremiah was quieter than he had been before. He did not play with his tin soldiers, and he did not tap out his drumbeat. He followed Arthur around the ranch, never straying far, as though afraid that if he let his father out of his sight, something terrible would happen again. Arthur understood. Trust, once broken, took time to rebuild. Even trust in the world itself. One afternoon, as they were mending a section of fence together, Jeremiah spoke up. "Papa, can I ask you something else?" "Of course. Do you think Mama would be proud of us?" Arthur stopped what he was doing and looked at the boy. Jeremiah's face was serious, his eyes searching. Arthur took a deep breath. "I think your mother would be very proud of you," he said. "You survived something terrible, and you did not give up hope. That takes courage." "What about you?" Jeremiah asked. "Are you proud of me?" Arthur set down the hammer he was holding and knelt so that he was at eye level with his son. "I have never been more proud of anyone in my life," he said. "You are strong and brave, and I am honored to be your father." Jeremiah's eyes filled with tears, and he threw his arms around Arthur's neck. Arthur held him, feeling the boy's small body shake with sobs, and he let his own tears fall freely. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the dirt beside the fence, holding each other as though they could keep the rest of the world at bay. That night, after Jeremiah had gone to bed, Arthur sat in his chair by the window and looked out at the darkening sky. The ranch was quiet, the kind of quiet that came from peace rather than emptiness. Buster lay at his feet, his breathing deep and even. Arthur thought about the past 3 weeks, about the despair that had nearly consumed him, and about the hope that had brought him back. He thought about Sarah, and how much he missed her, and how much he wished she could be here to see Jeremiah safe. And he thought about the future, about the ranch and the boy and the life they would build together. It would not be easy. There would be hard days ahead, days when the memories of what had happened would surface and threaten to pull them under. But they would face those days together, and that made all the difference. Arthur closed his eyes and let the quiet settle over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt something like contentment. His son was home, the nightmare was over, and tomorrow they would begin again. The first week after Jeremiah's return passed in a kind of haze. Arthur found himself waking in the middle of the night, gripped by panic, convinced that the boy's rescue had been a dream. He would stumble to Jeremiah's room and stand in the doorway, watching the rise and fall of the quilt until his heart stopped racing. Only then could he return to his own bed and find sleep again. Jeremiah seemed to understand. He never complained about his father's nocturnal visits, never asked why Arthur hovered so close during the day. The boy had his own demons to wrestle with. He flinched at loud noises and refused to go into town, even when Arthur suggested it might help to face the place where he had been held. Some wounds, Arthur knew, required time more than courage. The ranch work had been neglected during the weeks of searching, and there was much to catch up on. Fences needed mending, the barn roof had developed a leak, and the small herd of cattle had scattered across the far pastures and needed to be rounded up. Arthur threw himself into the labor, grateful for the physical exhaustion that came with it. Work kept his mind occupied, kept the darker thoughts at bay. Jeremiah helped when he could, though Arthur was careful not to push him too hard. The boy had lost weight during his captivity, and his strength was slow to return. Still, he insisted on doing his part, feeding the chickens, carrying water from the well, sweeping out the barn. Arthur watched him work with a mixture of pride and sorrow. The boy had grown up in the past 3 weeks in ways that no child should have to. One afternoon, as they were mucking out the horse stalls, Jeremiah paused and leaned on his pitchfork. "Papa, do you think the Reverend's partners will come looking for the gold?" Arthur had been expecting this question. He set down his own pitchfork and wiped the sweat from his brow. "I do not think so," he said carefully. "They know the gold has been recovered and that the law is looking for them. Coming here would be foolish." "But what if they do?" Jeremiah pressed. "What if they think we know something?" "We do not know anything that could help them," Arthur said. "And even if we did, we have nothing they want. The gold is back with the bank and the Reverend is in jail. There is nothing for them here." Jeremiah did not look entirely convinced, but he nodded and went back to work. Arthur made a mental note to keep the rifle closer at hand and to be more vigilant about locking the doors at night. The boy's fear was not entirely unfounded, and it would be foolish to dismiss it. That evening, Tom Whitley stopped by with a basket of vegetables from his garden and a loaf of bread his housekeeper had baked. He sat at the kitchen table while Arthur made coffee, and the two men talked about ordinary things: the weather, the price of cattle, the new family that had moved into the old Harrison place. "How is the boy doing?" Tom asked eventually, his voice low so Jeremiah would not overhear from the next room. "Better," Arthur said. "He still has nightmares, and he does not like to be alone, but he is eating again, and he is starting to smile." Tom nodded. "And you? How are you holding up?" Arthur considered the question. "I am grateful," he said finally. "Every day I wake up grateful that he is here. But I am also angry. Angry at Croft. Angry at myself for not seeing what was happening. Angry at the world for being the kind of place where something like this can happen." "That is understandable," Tom said. "You have been through hell, both of you. It will take time to find your footing again." "I know," Arthur said. "I just wish I knew how to help him. I feel like I am fumbling in the dark, trying to say the right things and do the right things, and I have no idea if any of it is working." Tom reached across the table and gripped Arthur's shoulder. "You love him, and you are here. That is what matters. The rest will come." Arthur wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that love and presence were enough. But he could not shake the feeling that there was something more he should be doing, some way to take away the pain and fear that still haunted his son. After Tom left, Arthur found Jeremiah in his room, sitting on the floor with Buster. The dog's head was resting in the boy's lap, and Jeremiah was stroking his fur with slow, deliberate movements. "Can I come in?" Arthur asked from the doorway. Jeremiah nodded, and Arthur sat down on the floor beside him. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft rhythm of Jeremiah's hand moving over Buster's coat. "I have been thinking," Jeremiah said eventually, "about what you said, about people doing terrible things for money." "Yes? Do you think the committee Reverend was always bad, or did he become bad?" Arthur thought about it. "I think most people are not all good or all bad," he said. "I think we all have the capacity for both, and the choices we make determine which side wins. The Reverend made bad choices, one after another, until he became someone who could do a terrible thing and justify it to himself." "Do you think I could become like that?" Jeremiah asked, his voice small. Arthur's heart clenched. "No," he said firmly. "You are nothing like him. You are kind and honest and brave, and as long as you hold on to those things, as long as you try to do what is right, even when it is hard, you will never become like him." Jeremiah looked up at him, his eyes wide and uncertain. "But what if I make a mistake? What if I do something wrong?" "Everyone makes mistakes," Arthur said. "That is part of being human. What matters is what you do after, whether you learn from it, whether you try to make it right. That is what separates good people from bad ones." The boy seemed to think about this, and then he leaned against Arthur's shoulder. Arthur put his arm around him and held him close, and they sat that way until the light outside faded to dusk. The following Sunday, Arthur decided it was time to take Jeremiah into town. The boy had been avoiding it, and Arthur understood why, but he also knew that they could not hide on the ranch forever. Sooner or later, Jeremiah would have to face the place where he had been held, and Arthur thought it might be easier to do it together. They rode in the wagon, with Buster sitting in the back. Jeremiah was quiet on the journey, his hands gripping the edge of the seat. Arthur did not try to force conversation. He simply drove, keeping the pace steady and unhurried. When they reached Redemption Flats, the main street was busy with people going about their Sunday routines. A few heads turned as Arthur and Jeremiah passed, and Arthur saw recognition dawn on several faces. Some people waved, others simply stared. Arthur ignored them and guided the wagon to the Spond general store. Inside, Mrs. Henderson greeted them warmly. She was a plump, kind-faced woman in her 50s who had known Arthur since he was a boy. "Arthur Caldwell," she said, beaming. "And young Jeremiah. It is so good to see you both." "Good to see you too, Mrs. Henderson," Arthur said. She came around the counter and knelt in front of Jeremiah, her eyes soft. "I am so glad you are home, sweetheart," she said. "We were all so worried about you." Jeremiah managed a small smile. "Thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Henderson stood and turned to Arthur. "What can I get for you today?" Arthur gave her a list of supplies, and while she gathered them, Jeremiah wandered over to the candy jars on the counter. Arthur watched him, noting the way the boy's shoulders relaxed slightly as he examined the sweets. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. When they left the store, Arthur suggested, They walked down to the church. Jeremiah hesitated, his face going pale, but then he nodded. They walked together, Buster trotting at their heels, and stopped in front of the building. The church looked exactly as it had before, white and clean in the sunlight. There was no sign of the darkness that had taken place beneath it, no indication that anything had ever been wrong. Arthur wondered if that made it better or worse. "Do you want to go inside?" Arthur asked. Jeremiah shook his head quickly. "No, I just wanted to see it, to remind myself that it is just a building, that it cannot hurt me anymore." Arthur nodded. "That is wise," he said, "and you are right. It is just a building. What happened here was because of a man's choices, not because of this place." They stood there for a few more minutes, and then Jeremiah turned away. "Can we go home now?" he asked. "Of course," Arthur said. On the ride back, Jeremiah seemed lighter, as though facing the church had lifted some invisible weight. He even laughed when Buster stuck his head over the side of the wagon and barked at a passing rabbit. Arthur felt something ease in his own chest, a tension he had not realized he was carrying. That night, after Jeremiah had gone to bed, Arthur sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to the territorial marshal, thanking him for his efforts in recovering the gold and apprehending Reverend Croft. It felt important to acknowledge the work that had been done, even if Arthur had played only a small part in it. When he finished the letter, he went to the window and looked out at the night. The sky was clear, full of stars, and the prairie stretched out endlessly in all directions. It was the same view he had looked at for most of his life, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like home again. Buster padded over and sat beside him, and Arthur reached down to scratch the dog's ears. "You saved him," Arthur said quietly. "I do not know how you knew, but you did, and I will never forget that." The dog's tail thumped against the floor, and Arthur smiled. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges they would face, he knew they would face them together, and that was enough. 2 weeks after Jeremiah's return, the nightmares began in earnest. Arthur would wake to the sound of the boy crying out in his sleep, and he would rush to his son's room to find him sitting up in bed, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. Arthur would hold him and speak softly until the fear passed, and then he would stay until Jeremiah fell asleep again. The dreams were always the same. Jeremiah would dream that he was back in the basement, locked in the pantry, and no one was coming for him. He would dream that Buster's tapping had been in his imagination, that his father had given up searching, that he would die alone in the dark. Arthur hated those dreams with a fierce intensity. He hated that his son had to relive his captivity over and over, and he hated that there was nothing he could do to stop it. During the day, Jeremiah seemed better. He was eating more, gaining back the weight he had lost, and he was beginning to take an interest in the ranch again. But the shadows were still there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to emerge when his guard was down. Arthur tried to fill their days with routine and normalcy. They worked on the ranch in the mornings, ate lunch together on the porch, and spent the afternoons on smaller tasks like repairing tools or organizing the barn. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Arthur would read to Jeremiah from the old books that had belonged to Sarah. The boy seemed to find comfort in the sound of his father's voice, and Arthur was happy to provide it. One afternoon, as they were working on replacing a broken wheel on the wagon, Jeremiah asked, "Papa, do you ever think about Mama?" Arthur paused, his hands stilling on the wrench. "Every day," he said. "Not a day goes by that I do not think about her. Do you think she can see us from heaven?" Arthur set down the wrench and sat back on his heels. It was a question he had asked himself many times, and he still did not have a definitive answer. "I do not know," he said honestly. "I would like to think so. I would like to think she is watching over us, proud of the man you are becoming." Jeremiah looked down at his hands. "I wish she was here," he said quietly. "I wish I could talk to her." "What would you say to her?" Arthur asked gently. The boy thought about it for a moment. "I would tell her that I miss her. and that I am sorry. Sorry for what? For not being strong enough, for getting caught by the Reverend, for making you worry. Arthur's chest tightened. He reached out and took Jeremiah's hands in his own. You have nothing to be sorry for, he said firmly. What happened was not your fault. You were a child in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you survived. That is not weakness. That is strength. But I was so scared, Jeremiah said, his voice breaking. I cried every night. I thought I was going to die. Being scared does not make you weak, Arthur said. It makes you human. And crying is not something to be ashamed of. It is how we let out the pain so it does not poison us from the inside. Jeremiah looked up at him, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Do you cry, Papa? Do you cry, Papa? Yes, Arthur said. I cried when your mother died, and I cried when you disappeared, and I cried when I found you. Tears are not the enemy, son. Holding them in is... The boy nodded slowly, and then the tears came pouring down his cheeks in a torrent. Arthur pulled him close and let him cry, his own eyes stinging. They stayed that way for a long time, holding each other beneath the wide Wyoming sky, and when it was over, Jeremiah seemed lighter, as though some burden had been lifted. That evening, Sheriff Moss stopped by with news. The two men who had worked with Reverend Croft had been apprehended in Colorado, trying to cross the border into New Mexico. They would be brought back to stand trial, and Moss wanted to know if Arthur and Jeremiah would be willing to testify. Arthur's first instinct was to refuse. He did not want to put Jeremiah through the ordeal of reliving his captivity in front of a courtroom full of strangers. But Moss explained that the boy's testimony would be crucial in securing a conviction, and that without it, the men might go free. I will talk to him, Arthur said reluctantly, but the decision is his. That night, after dinner, Arthur sat down with Jeremiah and explained the situation. The boy listened quietly, his face serious. What do you think I should do? Jeremiah asked, when Arthur had finished. I think you should do whatever feels right to you, Arthur said. If you do not want to testify, I will tell the sheriff no, and that will be the end of it. But if you do want to testify, I will be there with you every step of the way. Jeremiah thought about it for a long moment. If I do not testify, they might go free, he asked. It is possible, Arthur said. The boy's jaw set in a way that reminded Arthur of Sarah. Then I will do it, he said. I do not want them to hurt anyone else. Arthur felt a swell of pride. You are very brave, he said. I do not feel brave, Jeremiah said. I feel scared. Bravery is not the absence of fear, Arthur said. It is doing what needs to be done in spite of it. The trial was set for 3 weeks later, which gave them time to prepare. Arthur worked with Jeremiah, helping him understand what would be expected of him and how to answer questions clearly and honestly. The boy was nervous, but he was determined, and Arthur drew strength from that. In the meantime, life on the ranch continued. The cattle were rounded up and moved to better pasture, the barn roof was repaired, and the vegetable garden that Sarah had planted years ago was cleared and replanted. Arthur found a kind of solace in the work, a sense that they were rebuilding not just the ranch, but their lives. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch watching the sun set, Jeremiah spoke up. Papa, can I ask you something? Always. Do you think things will ever feel normal again? Arthur considered the question. I think normal is going to look different than it did before, he said. We have been through something that changed us, and we cannot go back to the way things were. But that does not mean we cannot find a new normal, one that feels right for who we are now. Jeremiah nodded slowly. I think I understand, he said. They sat in silence for a while, and then Jeremiah said, Papa, I am glad you did not give up on me. Arthur's throat tightened. I could never give up on you, he said. You are my son, and I will always fight for you, no matter what. The boy leaned against him, and Arthur put his arm around his shoulders. They stayed that way, until the stars came out, and for the first time since Jeremiah's return, Arthur felt something like peace. The days leading up to the trial were tense. Arthur could see the anxiety building in Jeremiah, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, the way he picked at his food and had trouble sleeping. Arthur did his best to reassure him, but he knew that words could only do so much. The boy would have to face his fear head-on, and all Arthur could do was be there to catch him if he fell. The night before they were set to leave for the trial, Arthur found Jeremiah in his room, sitting on the floor with his tin soldiers lined up in front of him. The boy was staring at them, his expression distant. "Can I join you?" Arthur asked. Jeremiah nodded, and Arthur sat down beside him. For a while they just sat there, looking at the 10 little painted figures. "I used to think these were so important," Jeremiah said quietly. "I used to spend hours playing with them, making up stories about battles and heroes. It all seems so silly now." "It is not silly," Arthur said. "You were a child, and those were the things that mattered to you then. There is nothing wrong with that." "But I am not a child any more," Jeremiah said, his voice tinged with sadness. Arthur's heart ached. "No," he agreed. "You have grown up more than you should have had to. But that does not mean you have to leave everything behind. You can still find joy in the things you loved, even if they mean something different to you now." Jeremiah picked up one of the soldiers, turning it over in his hands. "Maybe," he said, "but right now, I just want to get through tomorrow." "We will," Arthur said, "together." The boy nodded, and they sat in silence until it was time for bed. Arthur tucked him in, something he had not done in years, and Jeremiah did not protest. He simply closed his eyes and let his father pull the quilt up to his chin. "Good night, son," Arthur said. "Good night, Papa," Jeremiah whispered. Arthur left the room and went to sit by the window, as he had done so many nights before. Buster came and lay at his feet, and Arthur reached down to stroke the dog's fur. Tomorrow would be hard, perhaps one of the hardest days they had faced yet. But they would face it together, and that was all that mattered. The courthouse inn. Cheyenne was larger than any building Arthur had ever seen, a towering structure of brick and stone that seemed designed to intimidate. He and Jeremiah stood on the steps, looking up at the heavy wooden doors, and Arthur could feel the boy's hand trembling in his own. "Are you ready?" Arthur asked, quietly. Jeremiah took a deep breath and nodded. "I think so." They went inside, and a clerk directed them to a waiting room where Sheriff Moss was already seated. He stood when they entered and shook Arthur's hand. "The prosecutor wants to speak with Jeremiah before the trial starts," Moss said. "Just to go over his testimony one more time. It should not take long." Arthur nodded and squeezed Jeremiah's shoulder. "You will be fine," he said. A thin, serious-looking man in a black suit appeared and introduced himself as Mr. Daniels, the territorial prosecutor. He led Jeremiah into an adjacent room, and Arthur was left alone with Moss. "How is the boy holding up?" Moss asked. "As well as can be expected," Arthur said. "He is nervous, but he is determined." Moss nodded. "He is a brave kid. What he went through, most adults would not have handled it as well." Arthur did not respond. He was too anxious to make small talk. He paced the length of the room, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and tried not to think about what Jeremiah was going through in the next room. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Jeremiah emerged, his face pale but composed. Mr. Daniels followed him out and gave Arthur a reassuring nod. "He did very well," the prosecutor said. "I think we are ready." The courtroom was packed with people. Arthur recognized some faces from Redemption Flats, but most were strangers, curious onlookers drawn by the sensational nature of the case. He and Jeremiah were led to seats near the front, and Arthur kept his arm around the boy's shoulders, shielding him from the stares. The defendants were brought in, shackled and flanked by guards. Arthur had never seen them before, but he knew who they were: Jacob Trent and Samuel Oakes, the men who had planned and executed the stagecoach robberies. They were both in their 30s, rough-looking men with hard eyes. Trent was tall and rangy, with a scar running down the side of his face. Oakes was shorter and stockier, with a beard that covered most of his features. They did not look at Jeremiah, but Arthur saw the way their eyes scanned the room, calculating and cold. The judge entered, a white-haired man with a stern expression, and the trial began. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically, presenting evidence of the robberies, the recovered gold, and Reverend Croft's confession. Witnesses were called, including the stagecoach drivers and several townspeople from Redemption Flats. When it was Jeremiah's turn, Arthur felt his stomach twist. The boy stood and walked to the witness stand, his steps slow but steady. He was sworn in, and then Mr. Daniels approached. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor said gently. "Jeremiah Caldwell," the boy said, his voice quiet but clear. "Jeremiah, can you tell the court what happened on the afternoon of September 14th? Jeremiah took a deep breath. "I went into town to buy nails for the fence at our ranch. I finished at the general store and was walking back to where I had left my horse when I saw the back door of the church was open. I was curious, so I went to look." "And what did you see?" "I saw Reverend Croft in the basement. He was moving crates and barrels. I did not know what was in them at the time, but he looked nervous, like he was hiding something. I went down the stairs to ask if he needed help, and that is when he saw me." "What did he do?" "He grabbed me," Jeremiah said, his voice wavering slightly. "He pulled me into the pantry and locked the filed door. He said I had seen too much and that I could not leave." "Did he hurt you?" "No. He brought me food and water every day, but he would not let me go. He said his partners would kill me if they found out I knew about the gold." "Did he mention his partners by name?" Jeremiah nodded. "He said their names were Jacob and Samuel. He said they were dangerous and that I should be grateful he was keeping me safe from them." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. Mr. Daniels continued, "And how long were you held in the basement?" 3 weeks, Jeremiah said, "until my father found me." "Thank you, Jeremiah," the prosecutor said. "I know this is difficult for you." The defense attorney, a heavy-set man with a booming voice, approached next. Arthur tensed, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "Jeremiah," the defense attorney said, his tone conversational. "You said you were curious about the open door. Is it possible that you were trespassing?" "I do not know," Jeremiah said. "The door was open. I thought maybe someone needed help. But you went into the basement without permission, did you not?" "Yes, sir." "And is it possible that Reverend Croft was simply trying to protect you from his partners, as he claimed?" Jeremiah frowned. "He locked me in a room for 3 weeks. That does not feel like protection." There were a few chuckles from the gallery, and the defense attorney's expression soured. "I have no further questions," he said curtly. Jeremiah was dismissed, and he walked back to his seat. Arthur pulled him close, his heart swelling with pride. The boy had done it. He had faced his fear and told the truth, and he had done it with dignity. The rest of the trial passed in a blur. More witnesses were called, more evidence was presented, and then the jury was sent to deliberate. Arthur and Jeremiah waited outside the courtroom, sitting on a bench in the hallway. Buster, who had been left with Tom Whitley back in Redemption Flats, would have been a comfort, but they made do with each other's presence. After 2 hours, the jury returned. Arthur and Jeremiah were called back into the courtroom, and they took their seats. The foreman stood and read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendants, Jacob Trent and Samuel Oakes, guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted in applause. Arthur closed his eyes and let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Jeremiah leaned against him, his body sagging with relief. The judge sentenced both men to 20 years in the territorial prison, and they were led away. As they passed, Trent turned and looked directly at Jeremiah. There was no remorse in his eyes, only cold calculation. Arthur stiffened, but the guards moved the man along before he could say anything. Outside the courthouse, Mr. Daniels shook Arthur's hand. "Thank you both for your courage," he said. "Justice was served today because of you." Arthur nodded, but he did not feel triumphant. He felt exhausted and relieved and deeply grateful that it was over. He and Jeremiah walked to the wagon in silence, and then they began the long journey home. As they left Cheyenne behind, Jeremiah spoke up. "Papa, do you think they will stay in prison?" "I think so," Arthur said. 20 years is a long time. But what if they escape? What if they come after us? Arthur considered lying, considered telling the boy that it was impossible, that they were safe. But he had promised to always be honest with Jeremiah, and he would not break that promise now. "It is possible," he said, "but it is also unlikely. And if they do, we will face it together. We will not let fear control our lives." Jeremiah nodded, and they rode the rest of the way in silence. When they reached the ranch, Tom Whitley was waiting on the porch with Buster. The dog ran to meet them, barking joyfully, and Jeremiah jumped down from the wagon to embrace him. Tom walked over to Arthur and clapped him on the shoulder. "How did it go?" "They were convicted," Arthur said. 20 years each." Tom smiled. "That is good news. Real good news." Arthur nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the look in Jacob Trent's eyes, the cold promise of retribution. He was thinking about how to keep his son safe in a world that seemed determined to hurt him. But for now, Jeremiah was laughing as Buster licked his face, and the sun was setting over the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. For now, that was enough. 3 days after the trial, a stranger came to the ranch. Arthur was in the barn, repairing a saddle, when Buster began to bark. It was not the friendly bark the dog reserved for Tom Whitley or the occasional, the neighbor who stopped by. It was a low, warning growl that raised the hair on the back of Arthur's neck. He set down the leather he was working on and reached for the rifle he had taken to keeping close at hand. Through the open barn door, he could see a man on horseback approaching the house. The rider was dressed in a long black coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He moved slowly, deliberately, and there was something unsettling about the way he sat in the saddle, as though he owned the world and everything in it. Arthur stepped out of the barn, the rifle held loosely in his hands. "That is far enough," he called out. The rider stopped about 20 yards from the house and tipped his hat back, revealing a weathered face with sharp, intelligent eyes. He was older than Arthur had first thought, maybe in his 50s, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. "Arthur Caldwell?" the man said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Who is asking?" The man smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "My name is Silas Crow. I am an attorney, representing a client with an interest in your recent legal proceedings." Arthur's grip on the rifle tightened. "I do not know what you are talking about." "Come now, Mr. Caldwell," Crow said. "We both know that is not true. You testified against my client's associates, Jacob Trent and Samuel Oakes. They were convicted, in no small part due to the testimony of your son. If you have a complaint about the trial, take it up with the court," Arthur said coldly. "Now get off my land." Crow did not move. "I am not here to threaten you, Mr. Caldwell. I am here to deliver a message. My client is a businessman, and he believes in settling his accounts. The gold that was recovered from beneath the church belonged to him, and he wants it back." "It was stolen," Arthur said. "It belongs to the bank." "Legal ownership is a matter of perspective," Crow said, "but that is beside the point. My client is willing to negotiate. He does not want bloodshed. He simply wants what is his." "I do not have any gold," Arthur said, "and even if I did, I would not give it to a thief." Crow's smile faded. "You are a stubborn man, Mr. Caldwell. That is admirable, but it is also dangerous. My client has resources and connections. He can make your life very difficult if he chooses to." "Then let him try," Arthur said. He raised the rifle, not quite pointing it at Crow, but making his intent clear. "Now, I am going to ask you one more time. Get off my land." Crow studied him for a long moment. and then he tipped his hat. "As you wish. But I would advise you to reconsider. My client is not a patient man, and his reach is long. You and your boy might want to think about what you are willing to risk." He turned his horse and rode away, his black coat billowing behind him. Arthur watched until he disappeared over the horizon, and then he lowered the rifle and let out a shaky breath. Jeremiah appeared in the doorway of the house, his face pale. "Who was that?" "No one important," Arthur said, though he did not believe it. He walked over to the boy and put a hand on his shoulder. "Go inside and lock the door. I need to check the perimeter." "Papa, you are scaring me." "I know, son, but I need you to trust me. Go inside." Jeremiah hesitated, then nodded and went back into the house. Arthur heard the bolt slide into place, and he allowed himself a moment of relief before turning his attention back to the task at hand. He spent the next hour walking the property, checking for signs of intrusion. He found nothing, but that did little to ease his mind. Silas Crow's visit had been a warning, and Arthur knew better than to dismiss it. Whoever his client was, the man was dangerous, and he was not going to let the matter of the gold rest. That evening, Arthur rode to Tom Whitley's ranch and told him what had happened. Tom listened, his expression grim. "This is bad, Grim," he said when Arthur had finished. "You are dealing with people who do not play by the rules. You need to get the law involved." "And tell them what?" Arthur said. "That a lawyer came by and made vague threats. Moss cannot do anything unless they actually commit a crime." "Then you need to be ready," Tom said. "Keep your rifle close, keep the doors locked, and do not let Jeremiah out of your sight." Arthur nodded. He had already come to the same conclusion. The next few days were tense. Arthur found himself jumping at every sound, his hand never far from his rifle. Jeremiah noticed, of course, and the boy's own anxiety began to resurface. The nightmares returned, worse than before, and Arthur spent long hours sitting by his son's bed, trying to soothe him back to sleep. On the fourth night, Buster began barking again. Arthur was out of bed in an instant, rifle in hand. He went to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first he saw nothing, but then a flicker of movement caught his eye. There were men out there, 3 of them, moving toward the barn. Arthur's blood ran cold. He turned and ran to Jeremiah's room, shaking the boy awake. "Get dressed," he said urgently. "We need to go." "What is happening?" Jeremiah asked, his voice thick with sleep. "No time to explain. Get dressed and meet me at the back door. Hurry." Arthur grabbed a satchel and threw in what he could: ammunition, some dried meat, a canteen. He heard the sound of breaking wood and knew they were out of time. He ran to Jeremiah's room and found the boy pulling on his boots, his face white with fear. "Come on," Arthur said, taking his hand. They went to the back door, and Arthur eased it open, peering out into the night. The men were still at the barn, and the path to the tree line was clear. "Stay low and stay quiet," Arthur whispered. They slipped out of the house and ran, Buster at their heels. Behind them, Arthur heard shouts and the crash of the front door being kicked in. They had been found. Arthur pushed Jeremiah ahead of him, urging the boy to move faster. They reached the trees and plunged into the undergrowth, branches tearing at their clothes. Arthur could hear the men behind them, their voices growing louder. "There, in the trees. Perdition of Usazol." The gunshot rang out, and Arthur felt a sharp pain in his side. He stumbled but kept moving, his hand pressing against the wound. Blood seeped between his fingers, warm and sticky. "Papa!" Jeremiah cried. "Keep running," Arthur gasped. "Do not stop." They ran until the sounds of pursuit faded, and then Arthur collapsed against a tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Jeremiah knelt beside him, his hands shaking as he tried to see the wound in the darkness. "You are hurt," the boy said, his voice breaking. "It is not bad," Arthur lied. In truth, he did not know how bad it was, but he could not afford to find out right now. They needed to keep moving, to put as much distance between themselves and the ranch as possible. He tore a strip from his shirt and pressed it against the wound, tying it as tightly as he could. The pain was excruciating, but it sharpened his focus. He had to get Jeremiah to safety. "We need to get to town," he said. "To the sheriff." Jeremiah nodded, tears streaming down his face. He helped Arthur to his feet, and they began to walk, Buster leading the way through the dark woods. Every step was agony, but Arthur gritted his teeth and kept going. He would not let his son down. Not again. Hours later, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, they stumbled into Redemption Flats. Arthur collapsed in the street, and the last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was Jeremiah's face, pale and terrified, calling for help. Arthur woke to the smell of antiseptic and the sound of voices. His side throbbed with a deep, aching pain, and when he tried to sit up, a firm hand pressed him back down. "Easy now," a woman's voice said. "You have been through quite an ordeal." He blinked, his vision clearing slowly. He was in a small room with whitewashed walls and a single window through which sunlight streamed. A woman in her 40s, with greying hair pulled back in a tight bun, stood beside the bed. She wore a simple dress and an apron, and her hands were stained with what looked like iodine. "Where am I?" Arthur asked, his voice hoarse. "Doc Harrison's office," the woman said. "I am his wife, Martha. You were brought in 2 days ago with a gunshot wound. You lost a lot of blood, but the bullet went clean through. You are lucky to be alive." 2 days. Arthur tried to sit up again, panic surging through him. "Where is Jeremiah? Where is my son?" "He is fine," Martha said, her voice soothing. "He has been here the whole time, sitting in the waiting room. I will get him for you." She left, and a moment later, Jeremiah appeared in the doorway. His face was haggard, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but when he saw Arthur awake, relief flooded his features. He ran to the bed and threw his arms around his father's neck. "Papa," he sobbed, "I thought you were going to die." Arthur held him as tightly as he could manage, his own eyes stinging with tears. "I am all right, son. I am all right." They stayed like that for a long moment, and then Sheriff Moss entered the room, his expression grave. "Arthur," he said, "we need to talk." Arthur nodded and gently disentangled himself from Jeremiah. "What happened at the ranch?" "It was burned," Moss said bluntly. "By the time we got there, the house and the barn were both gone. Whoever did this wanted to send a message." Arthur closed his eyes, grief and anger warring inside him. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations. It was where he had grown up, where he had raised Jeremiah, where Sarah had died. And now it was gone. "Did you find them?" he asked, his voice tight. "We found tracks leading away from the property," Moss said, "but they disappeared a few miles out. Whoever these men are, they know what they are doing." "It was Silas Crow's client," Arthur said, "the one he mentioned. They wanted the fruin, gold, and when I refused to cooperate, they came after us." Moss nodded slowly. "I sent a wire to the territorial marshal. He is going to look into it, but without more information, there is not much we can do." "They tried to kill us," Arthur said, his voice rising. "They shot me and burned my home. How is that not enough?" "I am not saying it is not enough," Moss said carefully. "I am saying we do not know who they are or where they are. We need evidence, Arthur. Names, locations, something we can act on." Arthur wanted to argue, but he knew Moss was right. Rage alone would not bring these men to justice. He forced himself to take a deep breath and think. "Silas Crow," he said. "He is the key. He knows who his client is. If we can find him, we can find the man behind this." "I will put out inquiries," Moss said. "But in the meantime, you and Jeremiah need to stay somewhere. Safe. I do not think they are done with you yet." Tom Whitley appeared in the doorway, his face lined with worry. "They can stay with me," he said. "I have room, and I can keep an eye on them." Arthur started to protest, but Tom held up a hand. "No arguments, Grim. You are in no condition to take care of yourself, let alone the boy." Arthur looked at Jeremiah, who was watching him with wide, anxious eyes, and then he nodded. "All right. Thank you, Tom." Over the next week, Arthur recovered slowly. The wound in his side healed, though it left an angry red scar that he knew would never fully fade. He stayed at Tom's ranch, a modest spread about 5 miles from where his own property had been, and tried to adjust to the reality of his situation. Everything he had owned was gone. The house, the barn, the tools, the livestock, all of it, reduced to ash. The only things he had left were the clothes on his back, the rifle he had carried into the woods, and Jeremiah. And Jeremiah was more than enough. Tom was a generous host, giving them the spare room and asking for nothing in return. He cooked meals, tended to Arthur's wound, and kept Buster fed and happy. Jeremiah, for his part, seemed to find some comfort in the change of scenery. He still had nightmares, but they were less frequent, and he was beginning to smile again. One afternoon, as Arthur was sitting on Tom's porch, Sheriff Moss rode up with news. He dismounted and climbed the steps, his expression unreadable. "I found Silas Crow," he said. Arthur sat up straighter. "Where?" "Cheyenne. He has an office there, practicing law. I had a conversation with him, and he denies everything. Says he never came to your ranch, never made any threats. He claims it is a case of mistaken identity." "He is lying," Arthur said flatly. "I know," Moss said, "but without proof there is nothing I can do. It is your word against his." Arthur's hands clenched into fists. "So that is it? He gets away with it?" "Not necessarily," Moss said. "The territorial marshal is digging into Crow's background. If he is connected to the robberies, we will find out, but it is going to take time." "Time," Arthur repeated bitterly. "That is all anyone ever says. We just need more time." Moss sighed. "I know this is frustrating, Arthur, but the law has to follow its process. If we rush, we risk making mistakes, and these men will walk free." Arthur wanted to argue, but he knew Moss was right. He forced himself to nod. "Fine, keep me informed." Moss left, and Arthur sat alone on the porch, staring out at the horizon. He felt helpless, trapped by a system that was too slow and too cautious to protect the people it was supposed to serve, but he also knew that acting rashly would only make things worse. That evening, as he and Jeremiah were sitting by the fire, the boy spoke up. "Papa, what are we going to do?" Arthur looked at him, seeing the fear and uncertainty in his eyes. "We are going to rebuild," he said. "We are going to start over, and we are going to make a new life for ourselves." "But what about the men who did this? What about Silas Crow?" "They will get what is coming to them," Arthur said. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But justice has a way of catching up with people, and when it does, they will answer for what they have done." Jeremiah nodded, though he did not look entirely convinced. Arthur did not blame him. He was not entirely convinced either, but he had to believe that things would get better because the alternative was too dark to contemplate. A week later, the territorial marshal arrived in Redemption Flats. He was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, with a thick mustache and a no-nonsense demeanor. His name was Isaiah Grant, and he had a reputation for being thorough and relentless. He met with Arthur at Tom's ranch, listening carefully as Arthur recounted everything that had happened. When Arthur finished, Grant sat back in his chair and stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Silas Crow is a slippery character," he said. "He has been on my radar for years, but I have never been able to pin anything on him. He represents some very powerful people, and he is very good at covering his tracks." "So what can you do?" Arthur asked. "I can keep digging," Grant said. "And I can offer you protection. I have a safe house in Denver where you and your son can stay while I work the case. It is not ideal, but it is better than sitting here waiting for them to come after you again." Arthur shook his head. "I am not running. This is my home, and I am not going to let them drive me away." "Then you are a fool," Grant said bluntly. "These men have already tried to kill you once. What makes you think they will not try again?" "Because I am ready this time," Arthur said, "and because I will not live my life in fear." Grant studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but if you are staying, you need to be smart about it. Keep your guard up, trust no one, and if anything feels off, you come to me immediately." Arthur agreed, and Grant left with a promise to be in touch. Arthur watched him ride away and felt a grim determination settle over him. He did not know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he would protect his son, no matter the cost. The weeks that followed were a strange kind of limbo. Arthur and Jeremiah stayed with Tom, falling into a routine that felt both comforting and temporary. Arthur helped with the ranch work, mending fences and tending to the cattle, while Jeremiah resumed his studies and spent his afternoons playing with Buster in the fields. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Arthur could not shake the feeling that they were being watched, that somewhere out there, Silas Crow's client was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. He took precautions, varying his routine, keeping the rifle close, and always making sure he knew where Jeremiah was. Marshal Grant sent word every few days, updating Arthur on his progress. He had traced Silas Crow's financial records and found connections to several criminal enterprises, including the stagecoach robberies. But the evidence was circumstantial, not enough to secure an arrest warrant. Grant needed something more concrete, and Arthur was beginning to wonder if they would ever get it. One afternoon, as Arthur was working in Tom's barn, a young man rode up to the ranch. He was in his early 20s, with sandy hair and an earnest face, and he introduced himself as Deputy Harlan Beck, one of Marshal Grant's men. "The marshal sent me," Beck said. "He has a lead on Silas Crow's client, a man named Carlisle Wade, a wealthy businessman out of Denver. Grant thinks Wade is the one behind the robberies, using Crow as his lawyer and middleman." Arthur felt a flicker of hope. "Does he have proof?" "Not yet," Beck admitted, "but he is close. He wants to bring Wade in for questioning, and he thinks it would help if you and your son were there. Wade does not know what you look like, and Grant wants to use that to his advantage." "How?" Arthur asked. "He wants to set a trap," Beck said. "He is going to arrange a meeting with Wade, pretending to have information about the stolen gold. If Wade takes the bait, he will incriminate himself, and we can arrest him." Arthur frowned. "And where do Jeremiah and I fit into this?" "You will be there as witnesses," Beck said. "Hidden so Wade does not know you are present. If he says anything that ties him to the attacks on your ranch, your testimony will seal the case." Arthur did not like it. The plan felt risky, and he did not want to put Jeremiah in danger again. But he also knew that this might be their only chance to bring Wade to justice. "I will need to talk to Jeremiah," he said. That evening he sat down with the boy and explained the situation. Jeremiah listened quietly, his face serious. "Do you think it will work?" the boy asked. "I do not know," Arthur said honestly, "but I think it is our best chance to end this. If we can put Wade behind bars, we can rebuild our lives without looking over our shoulders." Jeremiah thought about it for a long moment. "Then I think we should do it," he said. "I do not want to be afraid anymore." Arthur felt a swell of pride. "All right," he said, "we will do it together." 2 days later, they rode to Denver with Deputy Beck. The city was unlike anything Jeremiah had ever seen, a sprawling mass of buildings and people that seemed to stretch on forever. Arthur kept a distance, a protective hand on the boy's shoulder as they navigated the crowded streets, following Beck to a hotel where Marshal Grant was waiting. Grant greeted them in a small, nondescript room on the second floor. He was accompanied by 2 other deputies, both of whom looked seasoned and capable. "Here is the plan," Grant said, spreading a map on the table. "We have arranged for Wade to meet us at a warehouse on the edge of town tomorrow night. He thinks we have information about the gold, and he is eager to recover it. You and Jeremiah will be in the loft, hidden from view. We will have men stationed outside in case things go wrong." "What if Wade does not take the bait?" Arthur asked. "Then we try something else," Grant said. "But I think he will. He is greedy, and greed makes people careless." The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Arthur and Jeremiah stayed in the hotel room, going over the plan again and again until they both knew it by heart. That evening, as the sun set, they climbed into a wagon with Deputy Beck and rode to the warehouse. The building was old and abandoned, its windows dark and its walls streaked with grime. Inside, it smelled of dust and bars, decay. Grant led them to a ladder at the back of the main room, and they climbed up to the loft, a narrow space beneath the rafters that overlooked the floor below. "Stay quiet and stay hidden," Grant said. "No matter what happens, do not come down until I give the signal." Arthur nodded, and Grant disappeared down the ladder. Arthur and Jeremiah settled into the shadows, and the waiting began. An hour later, they heard the sound of a carriage outside. Footsteps echoed on the wooden floor below, and a man's voice called out, "Marshal Grant, are you here?" "Over here," Grant replied, stepping out of the shadows. Arthur peered through a gap in the floorboards and saw a man in an expensive suit and a top hat. He was in his 50s, with silver hair and a carefully groomed beard. Carlyle Wade. "I trust this is not a waste of my time," Wade said, his tone imperious. "Not at all," Grant said. "I have information about the gold that was stolen from the stagecoaches. I know where it is, and I am willing to share that information for the right price." Wade's eyes gleamed. "Go on. But first, I need to know who I am dealing with," Grant said. "I need to know that you have the authority to negotiate." Wade smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "I have more authority than you can imagine, Marshal. I am the one who planned those robberies, the one who hired Trent and Oakes and Reverend Croft, and I am the one who will see that gold return to me, no matter what it takes." Arthur's breath caught. Wade had just confessed. He glanced at Jeremiah, who was staring down at the scene below with wide eyes. Grant stepped closer to Wade. "And what about the attacks on Arthur Caldwell and his son? Were you behind those as well?" Wade's smile widened. "That meddling rancher? Of course. He cost me a fortune when he interfered with my operation. I sent my men to deal with him, and I would have succeeded if he had not been so stubborn." "That is all I needed to hear," Grant said. He raised his hand, and the deputies burst out of the shadows, their guns drawn. "Carlyle Wade, you are under arrest for robbery, conspiracy, and attempted murder." Wade's face went white. He tried to run, but the deputies were on him in seconds, wrestling him to the ground and clamping handcuffs around his wrists. He shouted and cursed, but it was no use. He was caught. Grant looked up at the loft and nodded. Arthur and Jeremiah climbed down the ladder, and Grant shook Arthur's hand. "You did it," he said. "You got him." Arthur felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was over. Wade was in custody, and the nightmare was finally coming to an end. As they left the warehouse, Jeremiah slipped his hand into Arthur's. "Papa, can we go home now?" Arthur looked down at the boy and smiled. "Yes, son, we can go home." Carlyle Wade's trial was swift and decisive. With his own confession on record and the testimony of Arthur and Jeremiah, the jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict. Wade was sentenced to life in prison, and Silas Crowe, implicated as an accessory, received 15 years. Jacob Trent and Samuel Oakes, already serving time for the robberies, had additional years added to their sentences for the Pragside attack on the Caldwell ranch. Arthur attended the sentencing, sitting in the back of the courtroom with Jeremiah beside him. When the judge brought down his gavel and announced Wade's sentence, Arthur felt no satisfaction, no triumph. He felt only a quiet sense of closure, the knowledge that justice had been served, and that the men who had tried to destroy his family would spend the rest of their lives paying for their crimes. After the trial, Marshal Grant pulled Arthur aside. "What will you do now?" he asked. Arthur had been thinking about that question for weeks. "I am going to rebuild," he said. "The ranch is gone, but the land is still there. I am going to start over, and I am going to make it better than it was before." Grant nodded approvingly. That takes courage. If you need anything, you let me know." Arthur thanked him, and he and Jeremiah left the courthouse and began the journey back to Redemption Flats. Tom Whitley had offered to let them stay as long as they needed, but Arthur knew it was time to move forward. They could not live in someone else's home forever. When they arrived back at Tom's ranch, Arthur sat down with Jeremiah and laid out his plan. "We are going to rebuild the house," he said. "It is going to take time, and it is going to be hard work, but we are going to do it together. What do you think?" Jeremiah's face lit up. "I think that sounds good, Papa. I want to help." "I am counting on it," Arthur said. The next day, they rode out to what was left of the ranch. The sight was sobering. The house and barn were nothing but charred ruins, blackened timbers jutting up from the ground like broken teeth. The fields were overgrown, and the fences had collapsed in several places. It looked like a place where hope had died. But Arthur refused to see it that way. He saw potential. He saw the land that had sustained his family for generations, the same land that would sustain them again. He and Jeremiah set to work. They cleared away the debris from the house, salvaging what little they could. They repaired the fences, one section at a time, and began to plan where the new house would stand. Tom Whitley came by often, bringing supplies and lending a hand, and slowly the ranch began to take shape again. Arthur hired a carpenter from town, a skilled man named Samuel Porter, who agreed to help build the house. Porter was in his 50s, with graying hair and hands scarred from decades of woodwork. He was quiet and efficient, and he treated Jeremiah with kindness, teaching the boy how to measure and cut timber, how to drive nails straight and true. The work was exhausting, but it was also healing. Every board they placed, every nail they drove, was a step toward reclaiming what had been taken from them. Arthur found himself sleeping more soundly at night, his mind no longer consumed by anger and fear. Jeremiah, too, seemed lighter, more like the boy he had been before his captivity. One evening, as the sun was setting and the frame of the new house stood outlined against the sky, Jeremiah turned to Arthur and said, "Papa, I think Mama would be proud of us." Arthur felt his throat tighten. "I think so too, son." They stood together in the fading light, looking at what they had built. And Arthur felt a sense of peace he had not known in a long time. The past could not be changed, but the future was theirs to shape. As the weeks turned into months, the house took shape. It was smaller than the old one, more modest, but it was sturdy and well built. Arthur designed it with Jeremiah's input, making sure the boy had a say in how it looked and where his room would be. They added a small covered porch, a place where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set, just as they had done before. When the house was finally finished, Tom Whitley and several families from town came out to help them move in. It was a simple affair, with little furniture and few possessions, but it felt like a celebration. People brought food and well-wishes, and for the first time since the attack, Arthur felt like part of a community again. That night, after everyone had gone home, Arthur and Jeremiah sat on the new porch with Buster at their feet. The dog was older now, his muzzle graying, but he was still loyal and watchful, still the same animal who had saved Jeremiah's life. "It feels good to be home," Jeremiah said quietly. Arthur nodded. "It does." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Jeremiah said, "Papa, do you think we will ever forget what happened?" Arthur thought about it. "No," he said honestly, "I do not think we will. What we went through changed us, and we will carry it with us for the rest of our lives. But that does not mean it has to define us. We can choose to let it make us stronger, to let it remind us of what is important." "What is important?" Jeremiah asked. Arthur looked at his son, at the boy who had survived so much and still found the strength to smile. "Family," he said. "Love, the people we care about. Those are the things that matter, and as long as we hold on to them, we will be all right." Jeremiah leaned against him, and Arthur wrapped his arm around the boy's shoulders. Above them, the stars began to appear, one by one, filling the sky with light. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and endless. and Arthur felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life they had been given. It had not been easy. It had been painful and terrifying, and at times almost unbearable, but they had survived. They had fought for each other, and they had won. And that, Arthur thought, was enough. The seasons turned, and life on the Caldwell ranch settled into a new rhythm. Spring brought wildflowers to the prairie and the first calves of the year. Summer brought long, hot days of work and the satisfaction of watching the herd grow. Autumn brought the harvest and preparations for winter. And winter brought the quiet, reflective time when Arthur and Jeremiah would sit by the fire and tell stories, remembering the past while building toward the future. Jeremiah grew. At 12, he was taller and stronger, his shoulders beginning to fill out with the first hints of the man he would become. The nightmares still came occasionally, but they were less frequent now, and when they did, Arthur was always there to comfort him. The boy had learned to live with what had happened to him, to carry it without letting it crush him. Arthur, too, had changed. The lines on his face had deepened, and his hair had gone entirely grey, but there was a lightness in his eyes that had not been there before. He had learned that grief and joy could coexist, that love was stronger than fear, and that healing was not a destination, but a journey. Buster had grown old. The dog moved more. Slowly now, his joints stiff with age, and he spent most of his days lying in the sun on the porch. But his eyes were still bright, and his tail still wagged when Jeremiah called his name. Arthur knew the dog's time was growing short, and he dreaded the day they would have to say goodbye. But for now, Buster was still with them, still a part of their family. One evening in late autumn, as the first frost touched the grass, Tom Whitley came by for dinner. It had become a tradition, this weekly meal, a way of keeping the bonds of friendship strong. They sat around the table talking and laughing, and when the meal was done, they moved to the porch to watch the sunset. "You have done well, Grim," Tom said, looking out at the ranch. "You have built something good here." Arthur nodded. "It is not much, but it is ours." "It is more than that," Tom said. "It is a testament to your strength and your determination. You could have given up after everything that happened, but you did not. You fought for your son, and you built a life for him. That is something to be proud of." Arthur smiled. "I had help." "We all need help," Tom said. "That is what friends are for." They sat in companionable silence, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jeremiah and Buster were in the yard, the boy throwing a stick for the dog to fetch. Buster moved slowly, but he still tried, his tail wagging with each retrieval. Arthur watched, put them, and felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what mattered, not wealth or status or the approval of others, but moments like this, simple and ordinary and perfect in their own way. As the stars began to appear, Jeremiah came back to the porch and sat down beside Arthur. The boy was quiet, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "Papa," he said after a while, "do you ever think about what would have happened if Buster had not tapped on the window that night?" Arthur considered the question. "I try not to," he said. "It is too painful to think about. But I am grateful every day that he did. He saved you, and in doing so he saved me too." Jeremiah nodded. "I think about it sometimes. I think about how close I came to never coming home, and then I think about how lucky I am to be here." "We are both lucky," Arthur said. "We were given a second chance, and we have made the most of it." "Do you think Mama is watching us?" Jeremiah asked. Arthur looked up at the stars. "I like to think so," he said. "I like to think she is proud of the life we have built, and that she knows we are all right." Jeremiah smiled. "I think she is." They sat together in the quiet, father and son, bound by love and loss and the unbreakable ties of family. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the scent of sage and earth, and Arthur felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life he had been given. It had not been easy. There had been moments of despair so deep he thought he would drown in them, moments of fear so sharp they cut like knives, but there had also been moments of joy, moments of laughter, moments of connection that reminded him why life was worth living. He had lost his wife, his home, his sense of security, but he had not lost his son, and he had not lost himself. He had found a way to rebuild, to move forward, to create something new from the ashes of the old. And that, Arthur thought, was the true measure of a man. Not what he had, but what he did when everything was taken away. Not the ease of his life, but the strength with which he faced its challenges. The stars grew brighter, and the night grew colder. Tom excused himself and headed home, promising to return the following week. Arthur and Jeremiah stayed on the porch a while longer, wrapped in blankets, with Buster curled at their feet. "Papa," Jeremiah said quietly, "thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me, for finding me, for everything." Arthur pulled the boy close. "You never have to thank me for that, son. You are my world, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Jeremiah rested his head on Arthur's shoulder, and they sat together under the vast Wyoming sky, two souls bound by love and resilience, facing whatever the future might bring. The ranch was quiet. The wind had stilled, and the only sound was the soft rustle of Buster's breathing and the distant call of a night bird. Arthur looked out at the land that had been his, families for generations, the land that would one day be Jeremiah's, and he felt a deep sense of peace. They had survived, they had endured, and they had found their way home. In the end, that was all that mattered. The rest was just details, the ebb and flow of life that everyone experienced. What counted was the love they had for each other, the strength they drew from their bond, and the hope that carried them forward. Arthur closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of the night, feeling the warmth of his son beside him and the solid presence of the dog at his feet. This was home. This was family. This was everything. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the world turned on its axis, Arthur Caldwell knew that no matter what tomorrow brought, they would face it together, and that was enough.